Well, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the book briefing for this month, March, on Love and the Divine Feminine. And I've got with me the author of the book, which I reviewed in the last issue, Love and the Divine Feminine, and also our honorary member, Anne Baring, Dr. Anne Baring, whose work is absolutely seminal to this whole rediscovery of the divine feminine, and her magnum opus, the Dream of the Cosmos, was the book prize winner for 2013. And so it's a real delight that we have Anne here with us as well. And so Anne is in Hampshire, I'm in the Cathar country of France, and David is in Suffolk, in Aldborough. And I need to keep my eye on the ball because I have to admit people as well as keep talking, which is a little bit challenging. But I wanted just to contextualize this evening's conversation also in a couple of the other meetings that we've had in the last few days. The first is referring to Ian McGilchrist's talk to the London group on Monday, which many of you probably were attending. And he talks about this imbalance, between the left and right hemisphere in terms of thinking and systems, and which I think is absolutely central to this conversation this evening. And a couple of other things that struck me, which I'll just mention. And I mean, there were many things that Ian just needs to open his mouth to say something extraordinary insights coming out. But one of his remarks was the difference between disposition and proposition. So the faith, he said, was a disposition. It's an attitude. Whereas left hemisphere likes sort of dogmatic propositions and arguing about propositions, which is, that's not mystical theology. Mystical theology is very much about disposition. And the third thing I wanted to mention was this feeling that we can have if we experience closeness with another human being or with an animal or with nature, and closeness with the divine. And so I think part of the theme of this evening's conversation relates to intimacy, to closeness, to being together, rather than separating and moving apart. Then just from last night's talk by Glenn Park on the chakras as developmental map of the psyche, one of the themes that struck me was Jenny Wade's distinction between achievement and affiliation, or achievement orientation and affiliative or relational, and how the exam system, the education system that we have, tends to push us in this achievement direction and downgrade the affiliative, to the extent that some girls feel it's awkward if they say, well, actually, I'd really like to have a family as part of my future. And I've come across this in the work I do with young people in a poster program that I run. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. And I think the way we're going to start, and I just want to say a little bit more about David before I ask him to say something, is that David comes from a long heritage of Quakers and Quakerism. And this, I think, is very important in understanding his work. And many of you will have sat in Quaker meetings and experienced the quality of silence and the arising of insights collectively from the group, and the way that these can, in that wonderful phrase, speak to your condition. And then the other aspect that comes out in David's book is he's also a storyteller. And so he finds it important to be able to put his message across in terms of stories, as well as in kind of more linear arguments. And I'm going to start by asking him to read a passage which really contains his what he calls his proposition, from page 12 of his book, and that'll kick off our conversation. David.
Thank you, David, and good evening, everyone. It's such a privilege to be here with Anne, who has been my inspiration and my guide.
Could you put your volume up a little bit, David?
Yes, that's normally not a problem. I must be getting very old. There we are. Can you hear me better, everyone, now? Is that
Yes,
better?
that's a bit better.
Really,
Thank you.
really speaking to the screen. I hope that works. I was just saying how important Anne has been in my work, and indeed in this book. I quote her extensively and explain why I'm doing so, because she has very important things to say, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with her this evening. I suggested to David that I read just a short paragraph at the beginning of the book. I feel rather embarrassed with Ian McGilchrist's definition of proposition, because I call it a proposition. The left part of my brain must have been functioning when I wrote it. Anyway, there we are. This is what it says. And it starts by saying, I have written about love so often that I cannot remember what I have said and when I said it. So I shall start again and begin with a statement, a declaration, a proposition. There is a presence, a form of being which is beyond our understanding. It is good and it is loving. When we surrender to it, we are loved by it and we are drawn to love it. Given the limitations of our knowing, we begin to endow this presence with personality, for that is what we find in ourselves. And then for comfort, we call it God. But the moment we do so, the moment we seek to name it, we begin to limit it, to make it less than it is. And then we limit it again and call it Father, excluding half of our nature. And if we are not careful, we place him far away in the sky above us and wonder how we shall ever reach him.
Thank you. So that sort of sets the scene of how we've lost the divine feminine, and this obviously has to do with the history of religions. It has to do with the way that we moved from this lunar to a solar consciousness, which Anne explains in great detail. And lost the idea that love is in fact the law of being. And so in my view, we don't really take love seriously enough, and we need to take it a lot more seriously and then apply these insights to our public policies. So Anne, maybe you could tell us just in a nutshell about this transition, this history, and also how you see the reconnecting process with the soul happening in our time.
Well, that's quite a tall order, David.
Yes.
We can see a lot happening now in the general eruption, really, of a lot of anger, a lot of violence, a lot of distress, and stress quite apart from COVID. There's just a feeling that people don't know what's happening. They're alarmed, and they don't see where we're going, sort of thing. And the old structures are falling apart. And then we have something like the government saying they're going to increase nuclear weapons by 40% without any rhyme or reason in that. And that is frightening to people. I've had quite a few communications about that since yesterday. And there's the terrible murder of Sarah Everard, which has deeply distressed many women and many men as well. But it's an example of things falling apart and not knowing quite why. And women have been enraged by that murder and have sent 140,000 emails to the Home Office about their experience of being attacked or molested or harassed in the streets. 2 women are murdered every week in England. These are shocking statistics, and yet they've sort of crept up on us over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. This did not exist in my youth, in my sort of 20s and 30s. There was not this atmosphere of fear and distress and confusion. And a lot of it, I think, has come from social media. The fact that people can say anything they want on social media without having to say who they are. So they're completely irresponsible for what they're saying and doing. People who have been driven to take their lives, like Caroline Flack, for instance, because of persecution on the internet. So a lot is happening that wasn't happening 10 or 15 years ago because of the social media situation, I think.
So how do you see that? How do you rebalance that, or how do you see that changing, or and how can the divine feminine come in?
I think it's got to come to a further crisis. I don't know quite what will happen, but there's not enough yet to shift consciousness, because the climate change isn't close enough to us, although we've had plenty of warnings from David Attenborough, but it isn't near enough for us to see it in front of our noses. So there's nothing pushing us to actually change our awareness that something is radically wrong with the culture, and has been for a very long time, not just in my lifetime, but long before. So I see it happening. I don't know how it's going to come out or whether we're going to get through this birth process, but it is very upsetting and very distressing for a great many people. And I think everybody here would probably agree with me about the distress and the general feeling of something being wrong, deeply wrong.
Absolutely. And David, how do Quakers see this generally? Because the Quakers have been very active in social reform. And if you look at some of the major changes that have happened in society over the last 100 years, Quakers have been involved in most, if not all of them.
Well, the one thing that any one Quaker cannot do is speak for Quakers.
Yeah, okay, indeed. Yes, with that caveat, you can give your own view. Yeah.
Let me try and give my own view as a Quaker. And what I've tried to tease out in the book is that all the things that Anne has described and that we share concern about, none of that has arisen by accident. It has risen as a consequence. And the principal consequence, I suggest, is the language which we use in our lives, the language which we unwittingly take on and express, and the way in which we talk about things. Remember, the Buddha said, with our thoughts we make the world. So with our thoughts and our language we make the world. And if the language is false or degraded, then we will come to the very things that we are seeing at the moment. So what we're seeing at the moment is a consequence of a degraded language. And the prime element for me is that has been missing in that language, is of course what I propose, is love. If you take love to be of the essence, not a virtue, although it is, not a romance, which it is, but if you take it to be, if you take love seriously, as you said, David, and if you see it as being of the essence, then it would shape every word that you spoke and every action that you took. And we would be in different places. So that if we want to be in different places, we have to tackle our the language of patriarchy, violence, selfishness, isolation, economic domination. All of these are aspects of a profane language. And so, just to finish very briefly, what I try and do in the second chapter of the book is show how, in the great church of a great Western Christian church, instead of taking those remarkable teachings of love, which Yeshua brought to us, They were set aside in favor of a doctrine of original sin, sin and redemption, redemption through a great church, and of course, authoritarianism and violence and hatred. So it is not surprising that we have the language that we do have, because we haven't had the words that would enable us to have that shift of consciousness, which Anne speaks about so wonderfully in her latest book.
Let's go into that a little more deeply, because it seems to me also it's a suppression of a way of knowing and of mystical experience, of gnosis, if you like, as well as the suppression which you both talk about of the feminine Holy Spirit and the marginalization of Mary Magdalene. Anne, would you like to say a little bit about that? Again, huge area, but just whatever comes to you.
I might say too much.
Yeah.
Because I've been doing a lot of research on it recently, and a book has just been published in the Netherlands about Mary Magdalene, which proves beyond a doubt that she was married to Yeshua, Jesus, and that this was suppressed, as I've known well and as David knows well. The fact that she came to France and she brought with her the wisdom teaching from Yeshua, of which she was the teacher as well, appointed by him to be the teacher after his death or his disappearance. So we've lost a whole section of ourselves, and we've lost the essence of Jesus's teaching in that loss of Mary Magdalene. And it was deliberately done by the church. It's in that article that I wrote for Paradigm Explorer, the details of it. But it's in the church annals, the fact that Mary Magdalene went to France in 44 AD, and that she lived there for 20 years and taught there. And her burial place is known, and it's a sacred place and has been for 2,000 years. So there's a huge amount we need to bring back, all these fragments, but I don't know how to do it apart from my book. I feel helpless and powerless because there's so much to be done, and I don't know how to do it. So
I think it's part of a larger movement, though, Anne, isn't it? I mean, we've actually I've booked Anine van den Meer, who's the author of this book, to give us a talk on Mary Magdalene on the 13th of October. So we're planning well ahead on that one. But I think the return of gnosis as a superior and deeper way of knowing is also important, because we prize, the left hemisphere prizes the rational, the linear, the abstract, whereas gnosis is about not being separated from what you know, being contemplating it, being one with it.
Well, absolutely, because it's really what we have to do is reconnect the head with the heart, because the right hemisphere of the brain is connected to the heart. It's the first hemisphere that comes into being in the infant or in the embryo. So this is what we've lost, is that placing the emphasis really on the heart and having the brain, if you like, or the mind as an adjunct, but that the heart feeling function should be the primary way of relating to life in all our relationships and all our things that we do. And that's what's been missing. I've actually been listening to a very interesting talk by Greg Braden in America about this very thing, that the neurons in the heart are separate from the neurons in the brain. But if we can connect the two, there can be a marvelous harmony in the way that we relate to life, rather than sort of in bits and with one whole section shut off. And I think this is where David's work his book is so important, because this emphasis on love as a way of being and as a way of seeing is absolutely vital if we are to regenerate our dying culture.
How do you think, both of you, we can manifest this and build a movement in a sense? I mean, one way, I know Suzanne Taylor, I'm not sure if she's on this call at the moment, but we've been talking about trying to reinforce the movement for kindness. And so kindness, you could say, is love in action. Because this needs to be something that people feel they can contribute to, which will also help allay this sense of helplessness and despair.
I think we probably need to come together. Many organizations need to come together, perhaps Humanity Rising with Jim Garrison and many other ones, because alone, we really haven't got the clout to really bring about change. So I think that's one thing, coming together in organizations. But there has been, Karen Armstrong some years ago was doing a huge amount of work on compassion, but that seems to have died out. I don't know what.
Still the Charter for Compassion, it still goes on, the movement and cities of compassion. But you're right, it needs to be, in a sense, more explicit and coordinated so people would hear about these things and be able to support them.
I mean, if one could get it, perhaps Extinction Rebellion interested in the idea of love, that sort of thing, that could spread through a lot of people, young people particularly. It could be a new mode of chivalry. That's another thing that's completely gone. We need to revive the idea of chivalry and the service of man to woman and woman to man, so that's a different context, if you like, but it's very important. And young people are without any moral values. They're not brought up with, there's nothing in the culture to give them a sense of morality and a sense of direction in their lives and why they're on the planet in the first place. What the great gifts they have could be given to the world, so to speak, as they grow up and as they grow to their maturity. I know you've done a huge amount about this, David, in your work in Scotland, but that could be spread too, so that people are given a structure. There's no structure for the young in society. And then love
no
would be put
initiation either, is that we've lost the sense of initiation, and which traditional cultures have.
Well, we had some with the Duke of Edinburgh Award, because my grandson did that, which was very good for young men and women as well. But there needs to be perhaps an initiation into the meaning of love.
That's an interesting, very interesting thought. David, do you have any further thoughts along these lines?
There are two things I'd like to add into the discussion. Do you remember that marvelous Buddhist story about the monk who comes to the master and says, "Master, how shall I find enlightenment?" And he says, the master says, "Well, eat your breakfast." And the monk says, "Well, I've eaten my breakfast." "Wash your bowl." So I think for me, that's a very important story, because it points to the importance of closeness, action which is close at hand. The things that one can do every day in a particular way, which make a huge difference when a lot of people begin to do these things in a different way. So first of all, I always, when these big questions come out about how can we make a change, I start by thinking, well, how shall I have this conversation with you? Can I bring love and thoughtfulness to that? And then, of course, because I'm a Quaker, I place a great importance on silence, and in particular on gathered silence, which is different from sitting quietly by yourself, meditating or reflecting, because you're gathered with others in a shared silence. And during COVID, my local Quaker meeting has been holding every Tuesday for half an hour, a gathered silence on Zoom. Now, you might think that it wouldn't work at all because you're too far away from each other. It's been profound. It's extraordinary how repeated week after week with the same group of people, that silence, that gathered silence, has been of profound significance to those people. And I believe its energy spread beyond the group. So the close at hand and gathered silence would be two things I would.
Very, very interesting. And of course, many of you will know and come to the Sunday evening meditation with Peter Fenwick. And that's now up into the 80s and 90s of people coming together every week. So there's a sense of gathered silence, I think, there as well. And also, building on the meeting we had about the Maharishi effect, and that there is an inner dimension, there's an inner aspect to everything that's going on at the moment. And as another book I was reviewing recently, it said the mess out there reflects the mess in here. And so the inner and the outer, they mirror each other. I'd like to open up the conversation now to anyone who would like to come in and say something. We've got a few observations really to coming into the chat, but not so much questions and issues. So does anybody like to say something to contribute to our conversation? If you can stick your hand up. You know, hopefully you know how to do that now. It's under reactions, I think. So everybody seems to be rapt, but by the conversation that we're having at the moment.
Can I add another piece to it?
Yes, absolutely.
See where it would take us and where people, at the end of the book, I pose a series of questions that I think that the book has raised. And one of them is about gender. And I believe that the mistaken use of gender is one of the things that lies at the core of the damage that we are suffering. Brenda Crowther, who's doing a series on the I Ching at the moment for Ubiquity, she makes an important point when she talks about in the yin yang, you have feminine and masculine qualities, but you don't refer to them as men and women. So if we have qualities which we have called feminine and qualities which we have called masculine, they are in all of us. But once we, with prejudice, allocate one set to men and one set to women, we are building up an opposition, which then, I believe, leads to some of the tragedies which we have heard about recently. And I notice, and I'm far too old to be part of this, but I notice among young people that they are not wishing to be gendered in the old way, that they wish to create their own genders and express their genders differently. It's almost as if they almost unconsciously are coming to a realization of what one might call a new androgyny. An ungendered discourse, so that when we were talking about the qualities of the feminine, and as presented to us in the divine feminine, the wonderful stories of the goddesses which Anne has brought to us, we see that as qualities that apply to all of us, and that we can learn from and help us to shift our consciousness, because we certainly need to raise the feminine qualities into all of our discourse. I happen to believe that that means that we need to encourage and bring women's voices more into every circle of discourse. But it's the feminine qualities that we need because of the imbalance. What we're looking for is integration. But in order to get the integration, we need, I think, to be sensitive to the feminine qualities.
Anne, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, well, I absolutely agree with what David has said. I was also thinking about the quantum vacuum and how we're all connected. And maybe this is another thing that we could develop and teach people, because they're not aware that we're connected, so that we may feel things very, very deeply, both men and women, but don't know how to kind of know that we are feeling this, because we have that capacity to be connected with each other. And that's why I think this murder has affected us so much, because we feel, all of us, deeply affected by something like that.
And the need to reconnect. I just want to shift things slightly into a slightly wider view. Quite a lot of people have written about the rise and fall of civilizations and cultures, or the integration, disintegration. So William Ophuls, for instance, whose books I reviewed a few months ago, and John Reed, who had an article in the Paradigm Explorer again a couple of issues ago. That there is a sense of disintegration and decay, but at the same time, as Fritjof Capra argued in his book, 1980 book, The Turning Point, there is a whole regenerative revolution going on, but sort of under the radar, or it's not totally under the radar, but it's the rebirth, the regeneration, which has to happen but it has to, as we've been talking about this evening, it has to reach a sufficient number of people and be activated in a way that people can recognize and join in and feel empowered.
Yes, it has to become conscious, in other words. At the moment,
Yes.
it's, so to speak, below the radar, and therefore the culture as a whole, the top level, is not aware of it. But Toynbee, years ago, predicted all this. He said, if we don't, first of all, relate to nature, and if we don't regenerate our God image, we've had it as a civilization. He wrote that very, very clearly in his study of history, because he saw the collapse of older civilizations and why it happened in them. And he saw it happening to ours if we didn't change, but that was maybe 30 years ago or so.
Oh, more even. I mean, a book that was hugely influential on me, and which some of you who are listening to this may have read, is a dialogue with Daisaku Ikeda called Choose Life. And this came out in 1975. And it's an extraordinary dialogue. But he also says that there needs to be a revolution of love. He actually, I can maybe even find the quote before the end of the conversation, but he said that, and we need to move beyond our self-centeredness and devote ourselves to the whole. So he had this, his autobiography is called Experiences. And it's in this autobiography that I think he goes into more depth and this sort of spiritual dimension that comes across in Arnold Toynbee as well.
Well, I think what's happened is we've lost God, for one thing. And we need to recover a different image of God, or a different concept of God, or what much more what David was saying, just God as love, and as the generating impulse of the universe is love. If we could sort of bring that perhaps into consciousness, we would have a different concept of whatever it is the divine ground. So we've lost God, as I said. We have a secular culture. Christianity is in the background still, but it's not relevant for millions of people, and particularly for the young. So there's a lot we could do if we put our heads together, I think, or our hearts together, to change this concept of the divine ground from what it has been into this concept of love and also light. Those are the two qualities.
Exactly. Those are the essence. And in fact, we will, I think, be going into this in our Evolutionary Visions for the Future meeting on Saturday. So that'll be a continuation of the conversation. So I'm just going to ask Peggy to come in here, who had her hand up first.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Where are you speaking from, Peggy?
New Smyrna Beach, Florida.
Ah, wonderful. Looks like nice weather.
Yes, it is. Yes, the question always is, how do we come together? How do we make this happen? And it is hard. I have a college great nephew who's environmental science major, and we talk all the time about people like him. You know, they are the future. He wants to make a change, and how can I help him do this? And I think that's, again, Jim Garrison, that, you know, when he talks, that just reverberates in my mind about how we all have so many ideas, but how do we bring everything to the forefront? You know, am in the United States, where we are sometimes I feel like on the verge of civil war. And I have friends who are on the other side that I grew up with. And these people, and I think it was similar to what we might have heard about Hitler. He was a very loving father and kind man. And I think people who sometimes who are on that other side, I guess we'll call it, they don't think they're missing anything. They don't think they're missing love. They don't think they're missing what we see is missing. And I think that is what bothers me most. And I'll stop there because I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about that. I
Thank
just,
you very much, Peggy.
yeah, can make people understand a little more about what we're looking for.
Hmm. Who'd like to take that one up?
I'll try and respond. I know that feeling so well, Peggy.
Can you come further forward, David?
Sorry.
That's better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
I know that feeling so well, Peggy, and it's one I guess all of us sitting here have come across. And you almost feel, you're constantly told when you try and talk about these things, you've got to make this acceptable. You've got to turn it into something that people will accept. But of course, as soon as you let go of insisting upon the essence of love, you are already lost. So you have to, I believe, have the courage to speak of it again and again in small places. And at the beginning of my book, I share, I'm not the sort of person who has visions and experiences very much, but I did have one. And I'll just read a tiny little bit from it, give you a flavor of what it did for me, and perhaps then what it might be for other people. I say, some years ago, love came to me quite unexpectedly as I sat in my study here in Suffolk on a September morning. Love spoke to me for some time, and I wrote down what was said. Love said, and it goes on a bit, so I'm only going to read a tiny bit. Love said, I am the messenger of stars and of river, wind, and earth. Hear me. Invite me in. And for a while, suppose that what I say is true. For I speak of being in love. So I quote that just because in a way I feel that we have to have the courage and the faith to hear it, to hear love speaking to us, to allow love in to every moment of our discourse and action, now and now and now and now. Do you see? That for me, I can't find any other way of proceeding with this than doing that.
Thank you. And I think, and I'll be talking about a little bit about this on Saturday as well, but Gandhi said that love is a cosmological force. And that's a quite different level and meaning of the word. And Peter Dunoff said similarly that love is a force in the mind and a principle in the spirit. And this is really recognizing this cosmic dimension and to love, which we all incarnate and which we all long for, and we long to embody it. Anne.
I was just thinking, if only we knew that we are part of the divine, that we are part of what we've been worshipping, that would change our whole focus. That's one of my approaches, because we've had such a mistaken idea of what we are and what we are part of. So God has been something far, far distant instead of being our being, part of our being, so to speak. And this love is innate in us, as David has said. It just needs to find its way of expression and communion with other people. What we're really speaking of is an apostolic movement, I think.
But one which is one of principles rather than propositions. It's the disposition, not the proposition. Let's bring Sue in here. I just did ask you to unmute, Sue.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think nature's been mentioned, but I think the easiest divine feminine to love is Mother Earth. And I've certainly been plugging that with my grandchildren, although they did recently say that if we went somewhere away for a few days, wouldn't there be a television, which bothered me. But I think, yeah, I think if we can cultivate the love of nature, which I actually believe is very innate in us, watching children growing up, they are naturally drawn towards living beings and trees and so forth, seems to me. And I know that Anne, you've talked about that in your book. I'm not sure because I haven't read David Cadman, sorry, not yet. But I know that you talk about that and about what happened to the divine feminine in terms of the Garden of Eden. So I think, you know, these are very important ways in which the feminine spiritual aspect has been lost. I think we've lost that sense of Mother Earth, and any ways that we can get that back. I think in some ways, starting with children, at least with forest schools and so on, there is a glimmer of hope there. And we certainly need to bring nature in, not so much as kind of arguing the same way that the economists argue, but actually coming from that heart space to actually love what's in nature, which includes us.
And I think this will come up in Satish Kumar's talk next week as well. And I don't know whether any of you have read his wonderful article in Resurgence, the latest copy of Resurgence, which is really about this. And so where maybe there's it's in the air. It's in the air. Thank you so much, Sue.
But yeah, just widening it out to think about nature. Thank you.
Would either of you like to comment on that, or should we go on to the next?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that again, we are part of nature. We've been taught that we're separate from nature and that we're observers of nature, but we're not that. We are actually intrinsically part of a whole world. I mean, the whole planetary life. We are an aspect of it, and I think this is something that again could be taught to children.
And of course,
and they can experience this as well.
If you take the divine out of your garden and it's an unreachable place, it's not surprising, is it, that we do what we do to the earth, and we've got to stop it, of course, and with love.
And I think this is. I remember going to the small school, years ago when Satish had just started it, and he showed me around. There were only a few pupils, but they were in the process of cooking, making bread and growing vegetables. And if you can start doing that at an early age, I think it's a wonderful part of your education. You get your hands dirty in the earth and smell it. Marilyn, you're unmuted at the moment, so why don't you go next?
Oh, okay. I mean, Anne, when you say, well, I mean, for me, God is love. Love is the most powerful force and energy. It creates the universe in terms of unconditional service. It is the power of creation and evolution. There's nothing stronger than love. But if we've lost God, if we've lost love, when was the time that we had it? When did we lose it? When did we have it? Because I mean, the Old Testament is full of all these different tribes and sects killing each other, and sort of traditions of sacrificing young girls. And I mean, way back, if we've lost love, if we've lost God, when did we have it? It seems that violence in humanity has always been there. And I mean, but love is more powerful than war and violence. I love that middle chapter of Life in Fate, when the German soldier is lying beside the Russian soldier in a bomb crater and they're dying, and the love that they had for each other, like it didn't matter that they were on opposite sides. And other instances in war, like when the Germans and the Brits, when they left their trenches and sang together at Christmas. And why, if we've lost God and lost love, when did we have it? In terms
you'd like
of
to
violence.
Make that one up. And also maybe we could mention the fact that Yahweh had a consort, which is sort of written out of the Old Testament.
Yes, I think we lost it when we lost the feminine, which was back in 600 BC, when we lost the union between the male and female aspects of God at that time. And this was passed on to Christianity, who inherited the sole monotheistic God that we have today still. And I think the whole history of Christianity, instead of being about love, it was about power. All that the church was interested in was power, the Catholic Church this is, and the Protestant Church later on. So we've been conditioned to think about things all in the wrong way. because we have, as you mentioned, Captain Marilyn, when people are dying in the trenches, what is between them is this love, this brotherly love, really. So it's there intrinsically in all of us. We have it when we have children, our babies and everything. We have it with our dogs and our cats. And we know love there, we can recognize it, but we don't know how to live it in the general sense, in the culture as a whole, because we've been taught that we're all individual nations, individual tribes, individual races or ethnic groups. There's no understanding that we're all children of God, if you like, and we're all part of the same divine essence that we carry within us. So there needs to be a whole new teaching. I shall be too old to give it out, I'm afraid, but I think a lot of people now, led by David but the two Davids, a lot could be done to put out a very simple message of where we've been taught all wrong, in the sense that Marilyn's question has put to us, and where we could put it right quite easily, actually, just by changing our image of ourselves and our image of deity and our image of science that has been given us, the materialist science that's been indoctrinating us now for several generations or 300 years. That needs to be challenged as well, because they're completely missing the love element. There's no love of the planet, so to speak, in the scientific materialist view. So we have to go back to the teaching of Jesus, I think, and redefine it and reactivate it for our particular problematic culture.
Thank you.
I just add one more thing, that
Sure.
no Christian nation makes nuclear weapons. It's an absolute outrage to call themselves Christian, whoever has these dreadful weapons, it's America or the UK or France or Israel or whoever.
Absolutely. And I don't think people realize just what a dangerous situation we are in that respect, as well as others, which I know you've written. If you want to see, Anne has spoken about this on her YouTube channel, so do go and have a look at that. And with Scylla Elworthy as well. I'm going to bring Suzanne in, Taylor, and then we'll come to you, Diane, afterwards. And you managed to unmute yourself, Suzanne, so on you go.
Okay, this is such a treat for me. You know, I'm such a huge Anne fan, and anyway, it's just a real treat. But I want to throw something in that I don't think I've ever shared it. It was a hugely meaningful experience that I had about love years ago, and it's part of my understanding now. I was babysitting, that's not the right word, monitoring two people who had taken ecstasy. I had not. And I was with these two people. And what I noticed was the function of that substance is to bring you into the present moment. You have no past, you have no future. You're absolutely focused in present time. That's what it does for everybody. What was happening with these two people focused in present time with no past and no future was absolute love. Just because they were in present time, that's all. So when you put yourself in absolute present, it's love. So just throw that out as a little factoid that I have found very informative.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Diane.
That was an amazing, hang on, yeah, it's okay. That was an amazing thing for me to follow, because he's a good. All the drug taking and the naughty things that people do, ease out of everything, are definitely love generators. That's all you can think about, being wonderful. You don't get addicted to it. It's famous that you don't get addicted and all sorts of stuff, but that's a sideline therefore. What I actually wanted to say was that we are love. Everybody's, oh, I'm looking for love. You are love. As soon as you start giving it and loving, you are part of nature. We are all part of the one thing, nature. The oceans, the water, one little drop of water in a big, massive ocean of big water. We're all the same, really. And so therefore we need a new narrative that explains to us, those are the bits that we've lost. And the reason we lost them, if you like, you can go back 300 years or something to when the church started, or patriarchy started taking over. But if you go to kind of more modern times and see when the real crunch time happened, was round about when Thatcher and Reagan became governing, and and then followed by Tony Blair, people started realizing we don't want to be greedy, we don't want to be selfish, we want to do ease of good and all that. But instead we got Tony Blair. They thought that he was going to be a nice socialist person who'd look after and put new ideas out. And instead he did the same thing. He was a capitalist person who just thought it's about looking after yourself, the victim mentality. I've got to think about me. You haven't got to think about responsibility. It's all about what you look like. So now we've got generations of kids who don't know who they are, what they're supposed to be. Everything's about looking good and everything, but where is their soul? Has it ever occurred to them? Do they know about love? They haven't even heard the word of them. However, the last bit of it, Transition Town is doing the same sort of thing as Extinction Rebellion and Humanity Rising. There is a movement going on at the moment that Mother Nature, as far as I'm concerned, did the most spectacular thing when she allowed the pandemic to happen. Kayleen Asbo is another person that I saw at Humanity Rising, and she totally understands and says the same thing. This pandemic brought the world to a halt so that we can stop and take stock of what we're doing, decide what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and choose some new directions. Sadly, our governments haven't noticed that. They're just trying to get us back to normal. They're sending us back to normal school, normal times, everything back, get planes going again. We can all go on holiday. No real changes are happening, but underneath the radar, you've got Transition Town, who are doing an amazing, for 3 weeks, they've been doing workshops and stuff like that. So similar to Humanity Rising, coming up with solutions. And these are all young people coming up with solutions, and they're looking the same. I think there's the really old people, lots of the ones who are here, and the really young ones. All the rest have got to go out to work and kind of worry about the normal world, if you like. But the top, if old is the elders, I'm learning, elders work with the youngers, the snowflakes, we might be able to do some kind of constructive solutions. And the solutions in one word is unite. We just got to unite, all of us together. We are together anyway, really.
Yeah, there's a new book exactly of that title. Would either of you like to take that theme up? We've got about 5 minutes or so to go.
I think I'd like David to take it up.
Well, there are one or two more questions that I would have liked, who haven't heard, I would like to hear.
We've run out of hands at the moment, but we do have some comments coming in. Oh, no, we've got Helena, who has popped up. So Helena, let me unmute, ask you to unmute.
All right, thanks, David, and thank you so much, David number 2 and Anne. I could listen to both of you talk forever, and everybody has been contributing so many beautiful things. But the question that came up for me just in the last 5 minutes, it would be great if either of you could educate me on the roots or the time when spirit was equated with masculine and soul was equated with feminine. Because I've always wondered about that. I've always wanted to research it in terms of the division here too, between our own inner energies, the masculine and feminine. How did that happen? I mean, I don't consider my spirit masculine or my soul feminine. I think they're just elemental core parts of my being. So how in God's name and when and where in history and who is responsible for equating it like that and causing the ground of being within us to be split off like that? And then it goes on and on and on, and here we are. But I'd love to understand that a bit more.
Well, one of the major themes there would be the Logos and Sophia, and the way that Jesus, Yeshua, and Mary Magdalene represent the union of those two principles. We hear all about, in the beginning was the Word, was the Logos, but actually the Sophia is as essential.
Anne is the great person on this. I mean, it's in my book, but Anne should speak to this.
Well, my memory's going, and I don't know that I can, but because I made the distinction myself, actually, in my book, as soul is different from spirit. But I think that it's just come about partly through the fact that spirit has been given such emphasis and soul has kind of been marginalized, when really you can't separate them. They are of the same quintessential beingness, if you like. But I think personally, I sometimes use an illustration that the soul is the intermediary between our physical body in this dimension. We have to have a physical body in order to incarnate. Soul is the divine entity which incarnates, as it were, through the physical body. And beyond that is the whole realm of spirit, of which soul is a part as well. But soul kind of gets more distinct as it becomes the intermediary between the divine ground and the physical body. But I wouldn't take that as fact. It's simply the way I've kind of tried to explain things to myself. Because we've missed the feminine, which is the soul, as it were, the whole feminine principle is carried in the word soul. Because it's been so diminished and neglected and marginalized, soul hasn't been given nearly the amount of importance that it should have had. So, as I said, the emphasis has been on spirit. But if we can reclaim the beingness of soul that is at one with spirit all the time, when we die, we enter into the greater soul that we are, so to speak. Only a small part can be manifested in the physical body. So we enter into the greatness that we are in essence. And that in itself is part of the great realm of spirit. Is that okay, David?
Yes,
Right?
very much. We've got in the chat, we've got, oh, lovely, David.
Can I share this with you?
Yes.
I commissioned this icon from a Bulgarian woman iconographer. And of course, it's about the relationship of the masculine and the feminine. This side, which is where you start, we have Mary Magdalene washing the feet of Jesus, or Yeshua, as I prefer to call him. This side, we have Yeshua after the Last Supper washing the feet of Mary Magdalene. And in the center, we have the two of them sitting on the throne of the sacred marriage, the masculine and the feminine together, combined in a loving presence. And so for me, I have this to remind myself of what it is. And we may have lost it, we may appear to have lost it, but as Anne knows, the feminine has remained there, often hidden, for generation after generation. And what we are seeing at the moment is a re-emergence of the goddess energy. A re-emergence, you know, when you think about all the literature on Mary Magdalene that's been put together in the last, I don't know, 5 years, it goes from the most scholarly to the frankly bizarre. But it doesn't matter whether it's scholarly or bizarre. The point is, it's there, and people have found the need to express it. Why is that? That's the interesting question. And of course it is because of our longing, our deep longing to restore the feminine quality in our lives. And all we have to do, as I tried to put in that tiny little bit at the beginning of my book, we simply have to imagine that that's possible and let it in.
Well, what a wonderful summation, especially your beautiful icon, David. I hadn't seen that before. And that's really gives a right hemisphere understanding of what we've been talking about this evening. Anne, yes, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely beautiful. I've never seen anything to express that totality, as it were, as that icon. I think that what's been happening, there was in 1950, as you probably know, there was a papal bull which declared that Mary was to be raised to parity with the divine masculine, so to speak, in the Holy of Holies. And then there was an encyclical 4 years later in which she was made Queen of Heaven. And Jung thought that that was the beginning of the rise of the feminine principle. And I think it was, just that came after the war, 5 years after the war, when people were in the depths of despair and poverty and distress and everything. So that was the beginning of the resurgence of it. Then came a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, written by a friend of mine called Michael Bajan, followed by the Dan Brown book, Da Vinci Code and the film and everything. So the feminine has been pushing its way up through these unexpected directions. And as David said, there's dozens and dozens of books on Mary Magdalene. So there was a real interest of many, many women and men as well in Mary Magdalene. And so we're now getting the picture, the true picture, which we didn't have before, that the fact that she was the close companion and wife and co-teacher with Yeshua or Jesus, that she traveled to France and that her teaching somehow survived for at least 1,000 years or 1,200 years until it was regenerated in the Catholic Church of the Holy Spirit. So they had the feminine image of the Holy Spirit at that time in the 12th century, in the 13th century. Then it was wiped out by the Catholic Inquisition and the crusade against the Cathars. So it went to sleep for 6 centuries or 7 centuries until now. And now is the time, and it was predicted, the Cathars predicted that the laurel would bloom again in 700 years. And this is what we're seeing now, the blooming of the feminine, coming back to life, being regenerated and being reborn in our hearts when it's been so absent from our culture and our consciousness. So this is something very important that's happening and wonderful, really marvelous.
Totally. And the last Cathar to be burnt at the stake was Belibust in 1321, which is exactly 700 years ago. And this week, and unfortunately Marianne and I missed it, and they had the 777th anniversary of the 16th of March massacre at Montségur. So this week's quite an auspicious week to be, reviving the Church of Love, the Church of the Holy Spirit, but in a sense of a spirit sense, not a kind of dogmatic institution. So
know that.
Yes, no. So there's been a lot of action down here. Well, I think we've had a wonderful conversation, and maybe the seed of something. I've certainly got a few clearer ideas that could emerge from this, and which we'll take up again in our meeting on Saturday and then with Satish next week. And I think the idea of producing a very short statement or offering, really, because obviously some people agree, other people disagree, about the human image and what our deeper journey is about, especially aimed for young people, would be invaluable.
Yes, it wouldn't have to be long, maybe 6 pages.
Indeed. I think that's the point. So, Anne, thank you so much. David, thank you very much indeed. Thank you everybody for being here. And let's just finish with a minute of silence so we can gather ourselves and be in our hearts and minds together. Thank you so much. And I'll just close the meeting with a powerful formula from Peter Dunoff. May we have a heart as pure as a crystal, a mind as bright as the sun, a soul as vast as the universe, and a spirit as powerful as God and one with God. Thank you all very much. Lovely to see you all, and see you very soon, Saturday, whenever you're able to join us again. And do spread the word, and also the Gospel of the Beloved Companion. Have a look at that. That's what we've been talking about, among other things this evening, without actually stating it. So love to you all, light to you all, and have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
David.
Bye.
Bye.